Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good, and let your...
My topic is Marcian of Sinope. How many of you know who Marcian is or have heard of him? So probably not quite half of you, which actually surprised me. I feared more of you knew who he was than that. But what I'm going to present here today, I'm not presenting anything new, I'm not a scholar that goes and digs through stuff and finds new information. Everything I'm going to tell you is stuff that somebody else has already said somewhere. I'm hoping to present it in a way that maybe you haven't heard it presented before, or have arranged the information in a way that maybe nobody else has arranged it. And by doing that, I'm hoping that you guys will be able to see some connections you haven't seen and do some more research. And I really encourage you to not take my word for anything, but to go do your own research, because this is some really fascinating stuff. And I firmly believe that if you don't understand what has gone on before, you can't understand where we are. And that goes with the scriptures and pretty much everything. If you just start in the New Testament and that's all you read, you're going to be lost. You might think you know something, but you really don't know anything. And I think our walk is kind of the same way. If all you know is what's happened in the last 100 years or so, you probably don't understand why people are doing what they're doing. And part of what I'm hoping to show you is why some of our Christian brothers and sisters act the way they do when we try and talk to them. I know I've been frustrated for, I can't tell you how many times. I try to talk to people, we're using the same words, we're quoting the same verses, and yet we're 180 degrees off of what they mean. And why can't you see it? It's just, I mean, it's easy. But the fact of the matter is, if you have a different foundation of what you base your beliefs on, that you use the same words, but you're meaning different things. You're not using the same definitions for what you're using, and it causes a lot of frustrations. And I don't have any solutions to how to reach anybody. I mean, I wish I did. I wish I knew how to, show people where they're wrong, where I think they're wrong. I mean, they obviously think I'm wrong, but show them how come we're not seeing things the same way. And I really haven't figured out how to do that. But what I'm hoping to show you is at least a little bit of understanding of why they have such a sometimes very react in a lot of anger even when you're talking to them. And hopefully when we go through this, I'm hoping that if I'm successful in what I'm doing, you will see some of the reasons why people react the way they do and why you just can't get through to people. And sometimes, ourselves, we wonder how come it took ourselves so long to see it. I mean, I went most of my life without understanding this stuff and why. I mean, it's been right there the whole time. Been reading the same words, but all of a sudden I see them differently now. So, anyway, see if I can figure out how to make this thing work. Okay. So I guess also I need to start with this. I'm going to go through a lot of information pretty quickly. So I'm assuming that you guys are familiar with some of this stuff, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about stuff, but I am going to cover a lot of ground and a lot of history pretty quick. But anyway, I wanted to start with Psalm 146, and I'm gonna read that psalm. And I don't know right now if this is going to mean much, but hopefully by the time we're done with this, you'll understand why this psalm is what I chose here. Psalm 146, Praise Yah, praise Yahweh, O my being. While I live, I praise Yahweh. I sing praises to my Elohim while I exist. Do not put your trust in princes, in a son of man, in whom is no deliverance. His spirit goes out, he returns to his earth. In that day his plans perish. Blessed is he who has the El of Yaakov for his help, whose expectancy is in Yahweh as Elohim, maker of the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, who is guarding truth forever, doing right, ruling for the oppressed, giving bread to the hungry. Yahweh releases those who are bound. Yahweh opens the eyes of the blind. Yahweh raises those who are bowed down. Yahweh loves the righteous. Yahweh guards the strangers. He lifts up the fatherless and widow. But the way of the wrong ones he turns upside down. Yahweh reigns over Zion. Your Elohim to all generations. Praise Yah. So, before I go any further, Sandy, how do I start this timer so I know where I am?
Okay. There's a button on there that says timer.
You've got an extra half hour.
Start.
It should just go straight to a timer.
Set. Timer. Timer. Start. Oh, I'm not getting anywhere with it.
Let's see. We got this. Okay, so let's count up and start. It should just start. So let's count up.
Well, I don't feel so bad now.
I've got another one of these I can use for office time.
We had a
It's doing
problem
the
with that
count
at
up.
Shavuot, I think.
How about, do you want
Some-
to, I'll stand up and give you a little notice if you want. What do you want, an hour?
I'll go get the other one.
Hours?
Do you want to see the clock?
Yeah, that would be fine. She just gave me the clock, so that'll be fine.
You'll know when we're done listening.
Thank you, son. I need all the encouragement I can get. Okay, a prophet like unto Moses. I'm going to start with giving some background here, and I want to. Actually, I'm not sure. I'm not. I'm not sure why this is doing this, but pardon me?
You were pointing at the screen. You need to point at the.
Yeah, actually, it was picking it up, but I'm my PowerPoint. I've never done this before. This is the first PowerPoint I've ever put together and tried to put up. But I actually have a screen that has three. The next screen should be 3 points on it, and it's just putting them up one at a time instead of all three. So I just. Anyway, I'm going to read Acts 3:27. A prophet like unto Moses. Acts 3:27. So Peter's talking here. Is that right? 7:37. I'm right. No, that's not right. 3:22. Actually, 3:22. And Peter's talking here. And he says, for Moses truly said to the fathers, Yahweh your Elohim shall raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. Him you shall hear according to all matters whatsoever he says to you. So Peter's telling the people that there's going to be a prophet like unto Moses that was going to be raised up to him. Of course, he's referring to the Messiah. We know that. Peter's referencing the Messiah, and then the Spirit-filled Stephen says the same thing in 7:37. He tells them that in 7:37, this is the Moshe who said to the children of Israel, Yahweh your Elohim shall raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. Him you shall hear. So they're referring to Deuteronomy 18:15. That's where Moses said that. I'm going to skip some of these. I don't think we're going to have enough time to go through all these scriptures. But Deuteronomy 18:15 is basically where Moses tells the people that I am going to raise up, or Yahweh will raise up for you a prophet like unto me, and him you shall hear. Just as Stephen had said there. Let's go to John 5. John 5:46. So the reason I'm doing this is I think it's important to lay some background. You guys kind of need to know what my prejudices are and what I think, and so I'm laying down right here that the Messiah is who's being spoken of here by Peter and Stephen. And John 5:46 says, "For if you believe Moses, you would have believed me, since he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how shall you believe my words?" So John pretty much establishes the fact that Moses wrote about the Messiah. And in fact, the Messiah is the one, in my theology and what I see, the Messiah is the one speaking to Moses. When he heard a voice, it's the Messiah speaking. And so Moses heard from the Messiah, and Moses is prophesying in the future that he is going to come again. He's going to reveal himself to the people as a prophet, like it was revealed to him. And everybody's going to hear this prophet, who is the Messiah who came. So, where do we build our foundation? So, you can, we see all over when we're talking to people, we see that their foundation isn't the same place ours is. And I'm assuming that I'm talking to a group of people that has a foundation built very similar to mine, which is the Torah. For me, the opening words of Genesis is where I start building my foundation. And I build on that through the Torah and then the prophets' writings in the New Testament. But when you're speaking to somebody that builds their foundation on the New Testament, and they use Acts for their foundation, and then they build everything off of Acts and try to interpret the rest of the scriptures according to Acts, you may read the same words, but you're going to have a hard time coming to agreement with those people, because it just, with building your foundation in a different spot, it's not going to, the words are not going to mean the same thing. So, Scripture starts with a house, and the Father's heart's desire is to bring all his people back to his house. The first letter of Scripture is a bet, Bereshit. In the Hebrew language, it's Bereshit, and the first letter is a bet, which is the Hebrew letter for a house. And in Hebrew, I've just got to throw this in case some of you don't understand this. In Hebrew, there's no capital letters; they're just the script. But in the opening letters of Bereshit, or opening letters of the book, the bet in Bereshit is enlarged. And there are many that believe, of the ancient sages, that this is showing that Yahweh is starting his word with a house, and he's trying to gather all of his people back into his house. Because guess what? His people, pretty close to the beginning, I mean, you can't get much closer to the beginning than Adam and Eve, and his people separated themselves from Yahweh because they sinned. And so now they're separated from Yahweh and they're out of the house. And so now the Father's heart's desire is to gather everybody back into his house. And so pretty much the foundation of everything I believe is that if you follow the Father's rules, you get to live in the Father's house. If you don't follow the Father's rules, you're going to be out in the world and you don't get the Father's blessings because you're not in the Father's house. So, to me, the very first letter of Scripture pretty much has all my theology wrapped up in it. You either get in the Father's house and follow his rules, or you aren't. And you don't get to live in the Father's house and make your own rules. Now, some of you teenagers out here might not understand that, but that's the way it is. If you want to live in the Father's house, you have to follow the Father's rules. So, the Messiah speaks of building a house on a solid foundation. He says, "Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And every one that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them shall be likened unto a foolish man, and who doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And I'll submit to you, even though the book of Acts is scripture, and every word of it is true, if that's where you build your foundation, it's sand, because the Torah is the foundation. That beginning is the foundation. If you're building on something else, your house is going to be really shaky. So, the Messiah is the rock. He's the solid foundation. And the Messiah is from the beginning. So these are just a bunch of scriptures that establish that Messiah is the rock. So I'm gonna pick out a few of these and read them, but you know, and this is just a few. I mean, it's all the way through the scriptures. You go through the scripture, I mean, just everywhere you look, it establishes the fact that the Messiah is the rock. But I'm going to go to Isaiah 18:14. There's Isaiah 8:14, excuse me. Isaiah 8:14 says that, therefore Yahweh himself gives you a sign. Look, the maiden conceives and gives birth to a son, Emmanuel. Is that the right one? That's 7:14. I'm sorry. I'm going to go to 8:14. And it says, and he shall be for a set apart place, but a stone for stumbling and a rock that makes for falling to both the houses of Israel, as a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now I'm going to go to Peter 2:5, 1 Peter 2:5. In Peter 2:5 it says, you also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a set-apart priesthood, to offer up spiritual slaughter offerings acceptable to Elohim through Yahshua Messiah. Because it is contained in the Scripture, see, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, chosen, precious, and he who believes on him shall by no means put to shame. This preciousness then is for you who believe, but to those who are disobedient, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling, and a rock that makes for falling. So Peter is here again quoting Isaiah a little bit there, but it's also establishing the Messiah is our rock. Joshua Messiah is the rock, and he's been there from the beginning of Scripture. In other words, Messiah didn't come on the scene in Matthew chapter 1. That's not when he began. He began in the opening chapter. Well, in the first sentence of Genesis is where Messiah is first mentioned in the Scriptures. From there forward, the whole book's about the Messiah. So I'm going to read one more. 1 Corinthians 10:1. 1 Corinthians 10, for I do not wish you to be ignorant, brothers, that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were immersed into Moses and into the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed, and the rock was Messiah. So there again, I'm trying to build a foundation here so you guys don't have any questions about what my belief of the Messiah is as we start to get into this and we start looking at Marcian and some of the things going on there. The Messiah is from the beginning. Oops, going the wrong way. So Yahshua is from the beginning, and John 1:1-3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and with Him, without Him was not anything made that was made. So now that we've got that established, who is Marcian? And I've already asked how many people knew who he was, so I'm dealing with an audience that not everybody's heard of Marcian here. So we're gonna go through this briefly for a little bit. I'm going to spend some time just kind of laying a brief description of Marcian, and then we're going to kind of move into how he got to where he was. But starting with 1 John 2, dear children, this is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour. So John tells us that even at that time there was already the spirit of the Antichrist in the world. And I'm going to submit to you that Marcian was working under the spirit of the Antichrist, and there's more forces going on here than just a heretic that came up with some radical ideas. I'm going to kind of, I'm making an assumption here, I guess, that if we're in spiritual Babylon and we need to come out of Babylon, that we had to have gotten there somehow in the first place. We can't come out of Babylon unless we're already there. And my premise is a lot of us got into Babylon through the influence of Marcian without even having a clue that that's how we ended up there. So Genesis chapter 50 verse 20, but as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people's lives. So you all know the story. This is the story of Joseph. And his brothers threw him into a pit, and then they sold him to some Ishmaelite traders, and he went into Egypt, and he was a slave, and as far as they knew, he was dead. And they told the father that he was dead, and years later Joseph gets reunited with his family. You know the story. But now that their father has died, all the other 11 brothers Joseph is the most powerful man in Egypt, just under Pharaoh. And so now the father dies, so the other 11 brothers are a little bit worried that Joseph is going to take a little bit of revenge on them, since they put him in a pit and left him and sold him to these traders, and pretty much they thought they sealed his death sentence. And Joseph tells them that, you thought that you were doing evil against me, but Yahweh had it planned for good. So I'm going to build a premise here that Yahweh works in patterns and cycles, and he does the same cycles over and over again. And it's a biblical, you can see it through the biblical example that this is happening over and over. That what Hasatan, what the enemy intends for evil, Yahweh intends for good. And basically, my premise here is that Hasatan, the adversary, thinks that he's winning and got the upper hand numerous times as you're going through the scriptures and through history. But Yahweh's snookering him all the time because he's letting the enemy think that he's got the upper hand, but the whole time Yahweh's got a plan for good that's coming out of it. And so my next example is 1 Kings 12:24. Thus saith the Lord, ye shall not go up nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Return every man to his house, for this thing is from me. Now, this is the story of when the kingdom of Israel splits, and Jeroboam becomes king of Israel. He's Solomon's son. And he puts a heavy burden on all Israel. And Jeroboam comes and tells Rehoboam that, if you just lighten the burden, we'll all serve you. But Rehoboam didn't do that. He decided to listen to his young friends, and he increased the burden. So the 10 northern tribes split off from the 2 southern tribes, and basically kept the kingdom of Israel in the north. And Rehoboam decides he's going to go up and take back his kingdom that he just got ousted from. And then Yahweh comes to him and tells him, no, don't go up and fight against your brothers, because this division is from me. Here again, I submit to you, what the adversary meant for evil, intended for evil, Yahweh meant for good. Because if that kingdom hadn't split, the Israelites wouldn't have got scattered out through the nations, and guess what? We probably wouldn't be here today, because they spread the word throughout the world, wherever they went. So the reason I'm building this is because my premise is that a lot of times, and I'm just speaking from personal experience, we get mad and angry and upset about the situations that we find the world in and the church in because it looks like the enemy's winning. And we see all these people in the church system where, you know, it looks to us like they're blinded, they can't see anything, and that the enemy's leading them down the wrong road. But my premise is, we don't know what the Father is doing. We don't know where He's moving people. And even though it looks to us at this time and place in our life that the adversary is winning, because I assure you that for Joseph's brother, it looked like the adversary was winning. For Joseph, when he was put in the pit and sold into Egypt, he didn't know that he was going to end up being second in command in Egypt. It looked like he had lost everything. He had had visions of greatness, but it looked like, you know, Yahweh had changed his plan, maybe. And when Rehoboam lost the kingdom, it looked like everything was lost. But Yahweh had it meant for good. He knew He was in control the whole time when the men, looking from our perspective, thought it was all over. Okay, so Marcian was born, he was from 85 to 160 CE, and nobody really knows for sure when he's born. That's kind of a guess. But the point being here, you need to understand, is this, you know, the Messiah had just shortly been hung on the stake. This is right after the Messiah. Marcian was basically alive during the time that some of the last apostles were still on earth. So he's pretty close to the Messiah here. It's not like his theologies came several hundred years later. This is pretty close to the time of the Messiah. So Marcian was the son of the bishop of Sinope, and so his father was the head of the church there on the Black Sea, and he was raised in a home that was teaching the scriptures as was just handed down from the apostles. I mean, the apostles had just written their epistles. They'd just been teaching throughout the known world, and so Marcian's father was ardent enough to rise to the position of bishop. So Marcian was raised in an atmosphere of knowing the Word. And this is an assumption. It seems as if he understood the life of the apostles and what they were doing, because he's so close to when they walked on the earth. So Marcian was a wealthy ship owner. I haven't really actually found anywhere that explains how he got his wealth, if he was carrying on his father's business or a family business, or if he just made it all himself. I really haven't found anywhere that explains that. But we do know that he did quite well for himself. He was a very good businessman, and he made lots of money. And he was a wealthy ship owner. And in 140 CE, he gave 200 sesterces to the church in Rome. And he apparently was, and by this time, by 140 CE, the for lack of a better word to call it, I'm gonna call the church at that time the Christian church or the Catholic church, because that's where when you look in the history books, that's pretty much what you're going to see them referred to as the Christian church and the Catholic church. And Catholic, when it's referring to the Catholic Church, it's not really, we're not talking about a pope with a funny hat in Rome anymore. We're talking about just the universal church, that this is where where the new sect of these Jewish believers, they're now calling themselves Christians, and there's a universal belief among them, and that's what's being referred to as the Catholic Church at this time. And so that was by 140 CE, that was the head of that church was now in Rome. And so Marcian gave that church 140,000 sesterces, which is pretty equivalent to about $1 million of our dollars right now. And so it was a pretty large, sizable sum that he donated to the church. Well, it became pretty obvious that what he was doing was he's trying to buy himself the position of bishop. And that's was actually the purpose of that donation. And so he sat down with the presbyters in Rome, and had this over about a 4-year period, and he talked with them, and he's trying to attain this position of authority in the church. But as they listened to him, they started realizing that what Marcian wanted to teach and wanted to profess to the people wasn't quite in line with their teachings at that time. In fact, in 144 CE, the Church of Rome excommunicated him as a heretic and gave him his entire sum of money back. So, what was Marcian teaching? Well, Marcian taught that Jesus was a messenger of the supreme God of goodness. Marcian was teaching that that Jesus was bringing love to the world and grace to the world. These were words that Marcian, two of his favorite words was love and grace. And Jesus was the messenger sent forth from God to give us love and grace, and he was spreading the love and grace throughout the world, and that we needed to accept his love and accept his grace, and so he also taught that Yahweh is the God of justice, retribution, that Yahweh is the God of the Jews. And he taught that Yahweh was unreasonable and mean, and that his whole purpose was to bring judgment upon mankind and upon the people. That Yahweh's intention was to make you have to be punished for the things that you were doing, but Jesus was here to save you from all of that and to give you love and grace.
Oh, it's just a battery.
So notice that Marcian is still teaching that Yahweh of the Old Testament is in fact God. In fact, Marcian taught that Yahweh created the world. He taught that Yahweh created the universe, and that the Old Testament history is true. But he taught there was another God. There was the supreme God of goodness. Now, he doesn't really have a name for this God, or doesn't explain where he's from, or how this came to be, but the supreme God of goodness is superior to the God of justice and retribution. And that the good God, the supreme God of goodness, sent to the earth Jesus Christ to save you from your sins and to give you love and grace.
It's off now. It went off to 0.
Okay, so now Marcian taught that the Old Testament was true, and that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, was in fact the creator of the heavens and the earth, but he was the God of the Jews, and that the God of the Jews had somehow gotten it wrong when he created everything, and that he was sending a Messiah to the earth to be king of the Jews, to fight the battle for mankind that would bring all mankind to retribution for transgressing the God Yahweh, and that the Jews and their Messiah was going to come and bring judgment on the whole earth. But that the supreme God of goodness thwarted him by sending him his Messiah, Jesus, before the God of the Old Testament was able to send his Messiah. And it's interesting because Marcian believed that Jesus just appeared teaching. When you read Marcian's writing, there's no birth of Jesus. He just appeared teaching in Corinth, in Capernaum. Jesus just appeared in Capernaum teaching, and that he was actually a spirit and not flesh and blood. He was not born of mortal woman. So Marcian was teaching polytheism. He was teaching that there was a supreme God of goodness, and that he sent his Messiah, but in fact the God of the Old Testament was the one that created the heavens and the earth and the world and all that is in them. So, but actually, polytheism really isn't a good word for that, because polytheism kind of denotes that you're worshiping several gods. But what Marcian was teaching was there's only one God to worship, and that's the supreme God of goodness. But that the other God, Yahweh, was not to be worshipped, but only to be recognized as the creator. So in actuality, to be correct, he was teaching monolatry. He was a monolatrist, which means that you believe there's more than one God, but you only worship one of them. So how did Marcian develop these radical ideas? What was his perspective? I don't know if any of you that were here last year, you probably remember that Brother Bill, he did a wonderful teaching on perspective, and showed us how when we look at things in a different way, we see an entirely different picture. And so to understand Marcian, it's really important to see how was he looking at things? What was it? We know he lived fairly close to the time of the original apostles. We know that his father was a godly man. In fact, his father supposedly excommunicated Marcian from his own church in Sinope before Marcian went to Rome. The writings say that he kicked him out for harassing a virgin or something of that nature, defiling a virgin. But and especially because you learn more about what Marcian taught, what a lot of the people, writers say is one of two things. Either that actually didn't happen, and it was just because we don't have any records, real close records of what happened at the time, or in fact, the virgin that his father was talking about him defiling was in fact the church. And that's why he kicked him out of the church in Sinope. But anyway, we see that Marcian's is coming up with some different ideas about things, and because of when he's living in the time, where did these ideas come from? I mean, when we're watching out in the world today, we see some really crazy stuff, some crazy ideas. But we can figure out kind of how come people think the way they do, how they come up with these ideas. So we need to kind of step back and look at the times that Marcian lived in to figure out how did he get these ideas. So one of the things I submit is that Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion states that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I believe, of course, he's talking about in the physical world, but I believe that works in the spiritual realm as well. That for every action we have an equal and opposite reaction. And Sir Isaac Newton was not only a genius when it came to scientific principles, he was also a brilliant theologian. And many believe that the fact that he was such a brilliant theologian is what enabled him to see see the scientific principles that he came up with when nobody else in his age were able to see that. So anyway, I believe that Marcian is reacting to things around him. There's something happening in Marcian's life and around his time that he's reacting to come up with these ideas. So the first century. In the first century, the Jews had freedom of religion, but had to pay a heavier tax burden. And this is an important principle to understand. That during the first century, during the time the Messiah was here, the Jews didn't have to bow down and worship Caesar. No, there was no other conquered country that the people didn't have to worship Caesar at that time. But the Jews had shown that they just weren't going to do it. They weren't going to bow down to an idol. And so to keep peace in the region, Rome understood that they would let the Jews have their temple and they would let them have their Yahweh, their God, but they just paid a little bit more taxes for that right. And so the Jews acquiesced to that. They would pay the higher taxes, but they weren't going to bow down to Caesar. And so also in the first century at that time, we had a Levitical priesthood in place. The temple was still standing, and we had the Levitical priest officiating in the temple. In fact, we had at that time, when you read the scriptures, you read about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and other sects, but the Pharisees and the scribes and the Essenes, they didn't have any legal authority. They could come up with theological ideas and they could express their views and they could try to change policy, but they really didn't have any legal authority. The temple is where the legal authority came from, the Levitical priesthood, and that was where the Sadducees were. The Sadducees were part of they were either priests or affiliated with the priests. So the Sadducees were working through the priesthood, while the Pharisees were working outside of the priesthood, but they really didn't have any legal authority at that time. And so it's important to see that, because when we read the scriptures, it's good to, because most of the parables and most of the questions brought to the Messiah in the scriptures, the Pharisees came to him, the Sadducees came to him, and usually there was either an argument that was going on between Pharisaical sects or between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they were always trying to get the Messiah to side with one side or the other to show who was right. Realize they recognized he was the authority. They recognized that who he agreed with carried a lot of weight. So that was why they were doing it. But it's important to realize that at that time, the Pharisees didn't have any legal authority. So then in 68 CE, Cestius Gallus besieged Jerusalem. This is coming into the time of the Great Revolt now. It's after the Messiah has been crucified. There's upheaval in Jerusalem and in Judea, and so the Jews are starting to revolt. Persecution is increasing for the Jews. So the Jews are revolting, and so Rome sends Cestius Gallus and he besieges Jerusalem. Now, whenever Rome besieged a city, that was pretty much it. I mean, once they besieged the city, they stayed there until the city fell. But for some reason, Cestius Gallius retreated. After besieging the city, he retreated and left. And actually, there's really no real explanation for why he did so. But once he retreated, the followers of Messiah, the Nazarene, the followers of the way, they got the heck out of Dodge. They left Jerusalem because their master had told them that when you see armies surrounding these cities, you go to the mountains. And so they did what the master had instructed them to do. When Gallius moved back and pulled off his siege, the followers of the way, they left Jerusalem and headed for the mountains. Most of them went to Pella. But when they left, then later, Titus comes in 70 and besieges the city again. So now when Titus comes and besieges the city, it ends up, the temple ends up falling, the city falling, but the Jews of the time are very angry with the followers of the Messiah. Because you have to understand that the followers of the Messiah were all Jews. They were Jews in Jerusalem that were following the Messiah. And they were just another sect of Judaism. And that's what they were considered. They were considered a sect of Judaism. They weren't considered a separate religion. When Paul had the Damascus Road experience, he didn't convert into a whole separate religion. He just realized that he was wrong about who the Messiah was and started following that sect of Judaism that recognized Joshua as the Messiah of the Father. And so now when Titus comes and besieges the city, there's none of the followers of the way there to help. They're not fighting the battle. They're gone. They're traitors according to the rest of Judea. They're traitors according to the Jews. These guys have left us holding the bag because they all left. Well, they left because the Messiah said, when you see this happening, you leave Jerusalem. So they did. So then Titus besieges Jerusalem and he takes it, and according to Josephus, over 1 million people died at that time throughout the land. And it was a bloody event. And afterwards, after that happened, and the Jews start trying to rebuild their lives and rebuild things, they start coming, and they don't have a synagogue, or they don't have a temple anymore. So now the only place they have to go to meet is the synagogue. So as they start coming into the synagogues, there's great resentment because the followers of the way, the Nazarene, the followers of Joshua Messiah, they're coming into the synagogue to worship too, because that's what they do. Because they're a Jewish sect, so they come to the synagogue. But now there's starting to become a lot of conflict because the rest of the Jews are blaming this sect of Jews for the downfall of Jerusalem. If you'd have just stayed and fought with us, we'd have beat Rome. So you can see the tensions are really building. So after the downfall of the temple, now we start getting into rabbinic, and actually this really isn't correct. I have rabbinic Judaism fights for supremacy here, but it actually is more a Pharisaical Judaism, because rabbinical Judaism really isn't here yet. It's the Pharisees, the Pharisaical Judaism. They're starting to fight for this supremacy of Judaism. They're fighting for the hearts and souls of the people. But guess what? So is the followers of the Nazarene, the followers of the way. The followers of the Messiah is also fighting for the hearts and soul of Judaism. And both groups are gaining a lot of support because we don't have a temple anymore. We don't have the Levitical priesthood. So now there's a void there, and it's got to be filled by somebody. And both of and there's a lot of sects. Actually, at that time, you've got the Essenes and you've got the Zealots. There's many sects of Judaism that were in the first century. And at that time, you wouldn't have been able to look out over the landscape and say that the Pharisees were going to come out on top. You wouldn't have known that. You would have just seen there was a lot of infighting, and everybody was trying to get control of the hearts and souls of the people. But the two most prevalent ones are starting to develop into being the Nazarene, the followers of the way, and the Pharisees. So then in 50 CE, about here again with Akiba, it's not really known for sure exactly when he was born. There's a lot of different dates out there, what they say. But Rabbi Akiba was from 50 CE to about 132 CE. Now, how many of you know who Akiba is, Rabbi Akiba? So about the same people who knew where Marcian was. Rabbi Akiba is probably one of the most influential people in Rabbinic Judaism. And he's for Rabbinic Judaism, they consider him the father of the Talmud, the father of Judaism. And I personally don't think he was a very good guy. I think a lot of what you see happening right now can be traced back to Akiba. Yep. But in fact, about 12 years ago, I was at a conference in Salt Lake City, and I was standing in the marketplace there, and there was a vendor selling some things, and I picked up one of the books that he had there, and I was thumbing through it, looking at it, and Sandy Lawrence came by and said, "That's a really good book, you need to buy that." And I did, and read it, and it's probably one of the best books I've ever read in my life. Rabbi Akiba's Messiah by Daniel Gruber. Yeah. But anyway, it's just fascinating what was in that. Thank you, Sandy. So, anyway, where was I? I got lost track here. So, Rabbi Akiba comes on the scene, and Rabbi Akiba, or it's not Rabbi Akiba then, he's Akiba ben Joseph. And he's born he has humble beginnings. But he, over time, when he becomes an adult, he decides that he wants to better himself, and he sees to his education. He ends up becoming very influential in the Pharisaical sect of Judaism during the end of the first century. But coming into the second century is when Rabbi Akiba starts becoming very important. So now we're in the second century, and Pharisaical authority is close to gaining control of Judaism. Now we're starting to get into the period when we're actually getting into rabbinical Judaism, because things are changing now. The temple's been gone for a while, and these groups in Judaism are infighting and fighting with each other. But Pharisaical Judaism now is becoming the dominant authority, and they have the rabbinical schools. And when the temple fell back in 70 AD, when the temple fell, the Romans allowed there to be schools of teaching for the Jews under their control. They didn't allow the Pharisee or the Levitical priesthood to exist, but they allowed the teachers to build schools to teach intellectually teach the Judaism, and this morphs into rabbinical Judaism, and the rabbis and the Pharisees controlled this. And so now that Pharisaical Judaism is basically gaining control of Judaism, Akiba starts off at the bottom of the ladder, and he's a determined guy, and he fights all the way to the top. And it never looks like Akiba's ever going to be anything. I mean, he's always picking fights with the leaders. He's always arguing with everybody, and it doesn't look like he's ever going to get anywhere. But he just keeps persevering and persevering and persevering. And he basically starts eliminating all of his adversaries that disagree with him. And we don't have time to go into the methods of how he does that, but suffice it to say, he uses whatever method, very similar to watching politicians in Washington today. They will use any method they can to get where they want to go. And most of the time, you don't have a clue of what they're doing behind the scenes to get what they want. Well, Akiba was that type of guy, and he would do anything to get his position advanced. But Akiba also had a dream, and his dream is that the Pharisaical sect of the rabbis was going to control Judaism, and there was going to be no opposition. And everything he did was to remove opposition, whether it be within the Pharisaical movement or outside of it. Didn't matter. He removed all opposition. Well, guess who the opponents were besides the other Pharisees? They were the followers of the way. They were what is starting to later become the Christians, what they'll be called. But they're the followers of the way, the Nazarene. They're the sect of Judaism which is the closest to threatening his control. And so he's faced with a dilemma. I mean, he to control Judaism without any opposition, he has to get rid of the followers of the way. Now, he doesn't have to kill them all. Not that he would not do that. He would if he had the authority to do it. But all he has to do was disassociate them with Judaism, and now they don't have any say in Judaism anymore, and he gets to say the way everything is. So Akiba gains control of the Pharisaical sect of Judaism, which was later to become known as the Rabbinical Judaism, and he rules with an iron hand, and any dissent he gets rid of, and his former teachers he ends up having them excommunicated and sometimes stoned to death because they didn't necessarily agree with some of his tactics. The Akiba, in order to maintain and gain and maintain control, he developed a unique system of interpretation of the scriptures. Yeah. And basically what that unique system amounted to is whatever Akiba said, and nobody could oppose him because he's the only one that knew the interpretative method. Yeah. And so, of course, if you read the rabbis, they can go on forever about what his method was all about, and they still use it, by the way. But that's pretty much what it was. He could decide what every letter means and what every word means and change the entire meaning of a verse to suit his needs. And basically, once he decided what it meant, nobody could oppose him. And just an example of what type of person he was is when he was trying to come up the ladder and trying to gain control. It kind of reminds me of, remember the story about David and his son? What's the name of David's son that rebelled, the first one? Absalom. Absalom, yeah, David and Absalom. And after Absalom was banished and he comes back and he's standing at the gate of the city and he's saying, oh, but if I were king, you know, you're trying to get into here to see the king, but oh, he doesn't have time for you, but oh, if I were king, everything would be good. I would hear everybody's case and I would take such good care of the people. Well, Akiba was this same type of guy. He went around spreading dissent to the people who were the leaders at the time. He just kept saying, well, oh, if only I were in control, I would take care of this. And at the time, the Sanhedrin would, I think they say that if they had a death sentence once every 7 years, it was considered a bloody Sanhedrin. And so Akiba was saying, oh, it's just horrible how they're slaughtering all of our brothers. There's that Sanhedrin. They're just killing everybody. If only I were in control, there would never be a death sentence. Well, guess what? Akiba got in control and they were killing people every day. because Akiba, any dissent, they got stoned. So when he was looking for power, he said whatever the people wanted to hear, but once he gained power, nobody was saved unless you agreed with him. So then that brings us up to Bar Kokhba. How many of you know who Bar Kokhba is?
False Messiah.
So, again, even fewer. The Bar Kokhba revolt is also known as the second Jewish revolt. It began in 132. It was 132 CE, and actually started about 130, but really got going about 132. But what happened was Hadrian became emperor of Rome at 117. And when Hadrian became emperor of Rome, the Jews thought things were going to get better. He was talking about rebuilding the temple on the Temple Mount, and he was saying some good things. And nobody really knows for sure exactly what happened. But very soon after, Hadrian started changing his statements. He wasn't being as generous to the Jews as what he was saying. In fact, it wasn't long and he said instead of building a temple to Yahweh on the Temple Mount, he was going to build a temple to Zeus on the Temple Mount. So the Jews were up in arms. No, they weren't going to have it. Not building the temple to Yahweh is one thing, but we're just not going to tolerate a temple to Zeus on the Temple Mount. So by 130, and there were skirmishes going on through the 120s, but by 130 CE, the Jews were in open revolt against Hadrian. And Bar Kokhba at that time, actually his name was Bar Kokhba, and at that time, he rallied the Jews around him, and he revolted against Hadrian, and actually he was a brilliant general, and he did very well. And so since he did very well, more Jews came and followed him, and it was looking really pretty good for him to withstand Rome. It was actually quite incredible how well he did against the best army of the world very quickly, and it was obvious that he was a brilliant general. So Rabbi Akiba, who now is in complete control of rabbinical Judaism, but he still has those doggone Nazarene that are biting at his heels trying to get control, because they're still a sect of Judaism. The Nazarene, the Christians, they're still a sect of Judaism at 130 CE. They're not considered a separate church. They're a sect of Judaism. And Rabbi Akiba just can't stand it. So what he does is he decides that Bar Kokhba is the Messiah. Bar Kokhba is the waited for Messiah that we've been waiting for, and he's going to be the king of the Jews, and he's going to throw off the yokes of bondage that we're under, and all we have to do is follow him. Well, guess what? The Nazarene say, we're out of here. We've got our Messiah. We're not going to be following this guy. And they were following him up to this point. But now, they're saying, no way, we aren't going to follow this guy. We've already got our Messiah. So now, since the rabbinical Judaism is in control, and Rabbi Akiba is in control of rabbinical Judaism, they send out a decree that anybody that doesn't fight under Bar Kokhba is put to death. They kill the Nazarene by the tens of thousands because they won't follow Bar Kokhba, which is the whole reason why Akiba named him the Messiah in the first place. He knew he wasn't the Messiah. Akiba was a brilliant man. He knew the scriptures backwards, forward. In fact, I submit to you that if the Apostle Paul had not had the Damascus Road experience, he probably would have done the very same things Akiba was doing. Akiba was acting very similar to what Paul acted before he had the Damascus Road experience. But Akiba is a brilliant man, and he knew that Bar Kokhba was not this Messiah. But by claiming him to be the Messiah, he was able to purge all opposition out of Judaism. And so now the Nazarene are run out, they're slaughtered, if they aren't killed, their possessions are taken away, they're made to naught. They don't have any authority in Judaism anymore, and they're kicked out of the synagogues. They're just not allowed to participate in Judaism whatsoever. So So now, after Bar Kokhba, you have this void because the Jews had been meeting together as a group, and even though there was dissension, they always say, you have 2 Jews and 3 opinions or whatever. That was normal for them. That was normal for them to have dissension within their group, and the followers of the way in the Nazarene, they were just more dissensions within that group. So it was normal for them to have that, but now they were able to purge that out of there, and the followers of the way were forced to. A lot of them got killed. They were forced to either leave Judea. They were forced to lose all their possessions. They were made, if they stayed, they were second-class citizens. They had nothing. So now, at this point, this is where you actually have the breaking away of the Nazarene from Judaism. Up until this point, there's been they've been a sect of Judaism, but now they're starting to be known as something different. Now this is where you're starting to get the more prevalent term of the Christians, because, well, for one thing, the Jewish people are no longer in control of the sect. It's becoming controlled by the Gentile converts around Asia Minor, because, first of all, the Gentile converts, the people of the nations, have been converted into the sect and become part of the Nazarene, but also the people who were the original leaders of the movement are all getting killed. They're not left. So you're seeing a real big influence now of people coming into the movement who weren't raised with the Torah. They weren't raised with the teachings of Moses. And so they were raised in a Hellenistic way, and so they have that Western thought process. These people who are now starting to take over the movement and to be the leaders in the church, because they weren't raised with the Torah. So after the Bar Kokhba revolt, he ended up losing in 134 AD. He ended up getting killed. Rabbi Akiba, or 132 I think it was, and Rabbi Akiba gets martyred as well. Once the revolt was put down, the Emperor Hadrian put out the decree that no Jews could be in the land of Judea. He'd had it. That was it. So Jerusalem and Judea were not allowed to be home sites for the Jews anymore. Hadrian didn't allow the Jews to even get close enough to the land to be able to see Jerusalem. There was not to ever be a Jew to even be able to see the city of Jerusalem again. And Hadrian even went so far as to change the name from Judea to Palestine, because he wanted to wipe out all traces of Judaism from the land. And up until that time, the land was simply Judea. And, if you want to go back in history to when it was something else, you have to go all the way back to when the Jews were wandering in the wilderness. The Israelites, excuse me. The Israelites were wandering in the wilderness. Before they crossed over the river, the land was then called Canaan. But up until then, the land was Canaan. But after the Jews took the land, it was Judea, all the way up until the time when Bar Kokhba's revolt failed. And then the Emperor Hadrian renamed the land to Palestine to eradicate any vestige of any Jewish relevance or as home or anything in the land. And the land had never been called Palestine. The Palestine was named after the Philistines, which had a small strip on the coastal section, but the Philistines had never owned the land, and it was never called Palestine before that time. And it's one of those things that's an anomaly, because whenever you look at history, you always look at history according to the way things were at the time the history was written. But Palestine is one of those things that defies that. You'll hear people all the time, even in theological circles, you'll hear them talk about the first century Palestine. There was no first century Palestine. It didn't exist. In the first century, it was Judea. And by the middle of the second century, the name was changed by Hadrian to Palestine. But there was no first century Palestine is a myth. It never existed. That's a whole different story. Get me off on another. Anyway, the Jews were exiled from the land. Jews weren't even allowed to see Jerusalem from a distance. The name of the land was changed from Judea to Palestine. And now we have the first non-Jewish bishop in Jerusalem. So now, this is an important point to understand, and I know I've covered a lot of information really quick there, but I hope you guys can kind of connect the dots from the time the Messiah died on the stake to what's happened just barely 100 years later now. We're at 132, 133 CE now, just barely 100 years after the Messiah died on the stake, and now we have a Christian bishop that is going to rule in Jerusalem. He's a non-Jew Christian bishop. Well, guess how he was able to go to Jerusalem and to rule. Remember, up until this time, it's been a sect of the Jews, the Nazarene, the followers of the way, Christianity. It's been a sect of Judaism. And it's been in every bishop of Jerusalem up to this point. Jerusalem was the center of the religion. I mean, the religion went forth from Jerusalem just because it was part of Judaism. And up until this point, every bishop in Jerusalem was a Jew. But now we have a bishop, Marcus, coming into Jerusalem who's born, he's not Jewish. But in order to come to Jerusalem, he's a Gentile convert coming in, and he's going to Jerusalem to rule as bishop in Jerusalem, and he's able to do that because he denounces Judaism. That's the only way he can go to Jerusalem, because Hadrian doesn't let any Jews in Jerusalem. Doesn't let anything affiliated with the Jews come into Jerusalem. So Marcus is able to come in and sit as the bishop of Jerusalem for the Christian church by denying any affiliation with Judaism whatsoever. That's the only way he's able to come in there. So now we have the first link with the Christian church disassociating themselves with Judaism. And it's a very significant thing, because the Jews and the Christians were brothers. I mean, the converts that came in considered themselves to be a sect of Judaism. But now they're disassociating with Judaism and denouncing them, and vehemently denouncing them many times. So, I think I went further too far. So Christianity is now becoming dominated by non-Jewish. We see that by the fact that the Jewish Christians have been many thousands of them killed off during the Bar Kokhba revolt, and so now you see the influence of the converts from the nations that have come in, and now they're starting to have animosity towards the Jews. In other words, you don't have a situation now where it's very conducive for for your normal practicing Jew to look over and say, you know what, I think that was our Messiah. There's no friendliness being associated between the Jews and the Christians now. So now instead of Jerusalem being the authority of where the church gets its authority and where all decisions are coming forth from Jerusalem, now all of a sudden you're seeing a transfer of authority going to Rome. This is we're talking about the 130 CE. All of a sudden, instead of Jerusalem being for lack of a better word of saying it, the capital city of Christianity, now all of a sudden Rome. And it didn't happen overnight, but when Bar Kokhba's rebellion failed, it didn't take very long for that transfer of power to go from Jerusalem to Rome. And so now you have the bishops of Rome, which are kind of overseeing the church. And guess what? The bishops of Rome are all converts from the nation. Most of them really are not well founded in the Torah. And they're learning it, they're studying it, but they're not well founded in it like the Jewish brothers were. That's a very big point. So now you're getting into a position where the church leadership is beginning to become dominated by former pagans. These people that are running the church now were all former pagans. They were all polytheists. They were worshiping many gods. It didn't matter. That tree could be God and that rock. It didn't matter what it was. They'd worship it. And these are the people who are now running the church. And of course, they have an intellectual understanding that polytheism was wrong, and that there was one creator of the universe, and that's who they should worship. But when you have an intellectual understanding of something, but it's still going against everything you were raised with, it's really hard to purge that from yourself. It's really hard to and any of you that are on this walk now and you've come out of the church, you understand what I'm talking about. You didn't just wake up one saying, hey, wow, that Torah, that's where the truth is, and able to walk out the Torah. It took a long time to be able to see the truth in that book. I read that book every day, and every day I'm still amazed that I didn't see it last year when I read the same thing. It's incredible how long it takes when you're not raised with that. When you're not raised with that philosophy, and I think probably Natan's the only one here that's come even close to being raised with this Torah as a guiding principle from an early childhood. And Dr. Joe
was born and raised in it also.
Yeah. But that's not a very common thing. How many people have you run into, Dr. Joe, in your adult life that have known the Torah since they were young? They might have seen a picture of, animals' heads sticking out of a big boat, and that's about all they knew of the Torah. I was telling somebody the other day, I was 14 years old before I even knew that picture had anything to do with the Bible.
Dad, you got a question?
Would any of these non-Jewish Christian bishops been part of the 10 lost tribes?
Well, I couldn't answer that. Only Yahweh knows that. I myself, my personal belief is, with absolutely no foundation for it whatsoever, well, maybe a little bit, but my belief is that virtually all the people that heard the call of the Ruach and came into the church had something to do with the lost 10 tribes. That's just my belief.
They were grafted in and became part of Israel, one way or the other.
But whether they're grafted in or whether they actually have DNA, they had to have some kind of association there. They couldn't get grafted in without hearing. Yeah. Somebody had to preach that word to them, and the person they preached it, there's some kind of connection there to either the Jews or the lost 10 tribes. So, the church was dominated by the Jews, or by the pagans now, and Christianity is now definitely identifying itself as separate from Judaism. Up until this point, that had not been. But all of a sudden, now you have the schism in there, where not only are they identifying themselves something different from Judaism, but they don't even want to even be considered to have anything to do with it. They don't even want to, the Christian, because you got to realize that Hadrian just wiped the Jews out big time. In fact, when the Bar Kokhba revolt ended, it is said that at the end of the revolt, the price of slaves fell so far through the Roman Empire, and realize that the Roman Empire was big, and it had millions of slaves. I mean, tens of millions of slaves. But when the Bar Kokhba revolt ended, and there were over 1 million Jews that died in the Bar Kokhba revolt, but the rest of the Jews were rounded up and sold for slaves and servants, and the price of slavery fell so far that it is said that a slave was sold for the price of the fodder of a horse for a day. The price to feed a horse for a day. So, I mean, that had to be, I mean, we don't know how many people that is, but for that big of a market to sustain that big of a drop in price, we're talking about millions, probably 10 million people or more that just got pushed into the slave market. It was a devastating thing. It's really hard to describe how devastating the Bar Kokhba revolt was. So one of the natural reactions of that was, in fact, after the revolt, another thing that happened, and this is another thing that has a direct result on us today, is after the revolt, Hadrian made it illegal for any Jewish parents to circumcise their children. So circumcision was outlawed. They couldn't follow the rite of circumcision. They couldn't follow any Jewish rites. They had to give up all that Jewish stuff. That's why the bishop that went back to Jerusalem that was a Christian had to deny Judaism, because all those things were outlawed then. And for him to go back to Jerusalem and to set up Christianity in Jerusalem as a bishop in Jerusalem, he had to state in writing that he didn't have anything to do with the Jews or the Jewish sect or Sabbath or feast days or any of those things. So that's a very significant thing to understand. One of the reasons why, when you look at the church histories, how did they get rid of all these things? Well, if you go back into Jerusalem, he had to do that, and he must not have had any conviction on those things if he was willing to write those things off to begin with. But anyway, when I lost my thought of where I was going on that, but I'll have to just move on, I guess. Christianity defines itself as separate from Judaism. Okay, so now the Christians are starting to view the Jews as their enemy, and there again, this has not been the case up until this time. So you're seeing this schism coming in between the Jews and the Christians. And so when Hadrian wiped out the Jews more or less in the Bar Kokhba revolt, it was an amazing, huge slaughter. And so now the Christians that had been brought into the church from the nations, the ones that didn't have Jewish backgrounds, it's very convenient for them to say they didn't ever know, I didn't even know any Jews, and I didn't have anything to do with them, because they're afraid of retribution from Hadrian. They're afraid because there's actually starting to be persecution of the Christians at this time too, but it's nothing like the persecution of the Jews. And so Akiba was able to successfully push the Jews out of Judaism, and so now the Jews are being persecuted, and now the Christians aren't quite getting as much persecution as the Jews now, but it's really convenient for the Christians to say, I don't believe in those Jewish things. That's not what we're all about. It's just about Messiah, nothing else. We don't do those Jewish things here. That's pretty much what the testimony of the Christians were after Hadrian that wanted to stay in the church. And of course that might sound familiar. So now, at this point, now you're starting to see anti-Semitism creep into the church, because You can see the natural result here. Remember, we're talking about for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. You're starting to see the reactions come into the church of what happened. But remember, my other premise is that everything that the adversary intended for evil, Yahweh meant for good. Even though, this all looks evil, and when we look at this, it looks like horrible things that happened, but Yahweh's in control. He knows what he's doing. Just like when he split the 10 tribes off, that was from Yahweh. It needed to be done. And at this time, if the Jews and the Christians had stayed one homogeneous group, they would still be worshiping in Jerusalem and we wouldn't have heard about it. I mean, that's basically, even though Paul went out and he had, he evangelized around the world, that still the focus of all the worship would have stayed in Jerusalem, and it would have ended up just kind of coming back to Jerusalem where the worship would have been if the Jews and Christians would have never been separated. I believe the Father purposely used men to separate the two groups so that the two houses could go out and each do their own, do what they're intended to do.
That's right. The enemy intended for bad. Y'all turned around for good.
So Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, from 98 to 170 AD, he said, "For if we are still practicing Judaism, we admit that we have not received God's favor. It is wrong to talk about Jesus Christ and live like Jews. For Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity." What? but this is what's being taught now. I mean, this is shortly after the fall of Jerusalem and Bar Kokhba's revolt, and so this is the result. This is to separate themselves from the Jews. The church fathers at this time are seeing themselves totally separate, and not only are they totally separate, they're seeing the Jews as the enemy and what the Jews do as enemy practices. So Justin Martyr, who had many letters that went back and forth for a lot of years with Trifo, I'm not sure how you say it. Trifo. One of his quotes here, in one of his letters, "We too would observe your circumcision of the flesh, your Sabbath days, and in a word, all your festivals, if we were not aware of the reason why they were imposed upon you, namely, because of your sins and the hardness of your hearts." I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I just can't even hardly believe it when I read this stuff. I mean, because like I'm telling you, this is hardly 100 years after the Messiah died on the tree, and it's only a few years. I mean, you're talking less than 10 years, and the Jewish people were the head of the church and the ones that were dominating the church, and now within 10 or 15 years, all of a sudden anything Jewish is to be considered evil. It astounds me. I can't hardly believe it. So, the customs, this is more of Justin Martyr to Trifo. The customs of circumcising the flesh handed down from Abraham was given to you as a distinguishing mark to set you off from other nations and from us Christians. You get that? This is to separate you from the... What scriptures is he reading? I don't know. The purpose of this was that you and only you might suffer the afflictions that are now justly yours, that only your land be desolated, and your cities ruined by fire, and the fruits of your land be eaten by strangers before your very eyes, that not one of you be permitted to enter your city Jerusalem. Your circumcision of the flesh is the only mark by which you can certainly be distinguished from other men. As I stated before, it was by reason of your sins and the sins of your fathers that among other peoples God imposed upon you the observance of the Sabbath as a mark. So Justin Martyr can't seem to keep it straight. He doesn't really remember if circumcision's the mark or Sabbath's the mark, but it doesn't matter. I mean, that's the mark that shows that you're a Jew and not to be associated with. You know, can't be doing those Sabbath things. But you can see this, as I stated, this is a short time after the Messiah was here. And these teachings are being crept in because of, and the reason why these men are believing this and teaching this is because the horrible way the Romans treated the Jews. And not only in their minds, they're seeing if the Jews are treated this bad, they have to fallen from grace. God's got to be mad at them if they've fallen this far. And not only that, but there's probably a little bit of fear there too, that they want to say the right things to keep the Romans happy with them. You know, I mean, I don't know that, but I suspicion that fear is a big motivator in these things. So that brings us up to dispensationalism. Now, dispensationalism really it's not really a second century thing. That's where it really got started. That's more of an, you know, the 18th, 19th century type belief that really, when it really got into what we know it as today. But at this time, the church starts identifying itself as separate from Israel. No longer does the church see itself as Israel, because remember, to the church now, Israel is those Jewish things. And so it can't really identify with Israel because that's just kind of too close to the Jews. So, you know, they might be able to be spiritual Israel or something, but they really can't identify themselves with Israel. And then the church begins to teach that God has a different set of laws for different times in human history. So you can see in the second century here, the stage is being set for a lot of the doctrines that we get taught every Sunday when we go to church. A lot of what we learn every Sunday is coming out of what happened here in a few years from about 130 CE to about 160 CE. There were so many things that happened that affects what we see in church every Sunday right now that it's really astounding. Anyway, this is kind of where I need to stop. After this, I've given you the background now of coming up to Marcian. So when we start back up again on the next session, we will then talk more about Marcian from this background of why Marcian believed and taught what he did and how he, because now we can kind of see, because my premise is here that Akiba was the force or the action that Marcian is the equal and opposite reaction to. So once you understand Akiba and what Akiba does, now all of a sudden you start seeing what Marcian is doing, and they're both at both ends of the spectrum. And neither one of them are good guys. Yep. Anyway.
Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon his name. He is near. He is near. He is near. Yeshu Hashem behir matzov keravu yoto karov karov Yasov rasha darko leishavim machshevotav yashovel adom shem Yarbe is Yeshu Hashem behim matzo keravu yota karo the Lord while he may be found. Call upon his name. He is near, he is near. Yeshua Hashem behi matzot